The hall held 400 witnesses when Cale Stormborn stood at the altar and turned away from his bride. Not slowly, not with ceremony or doubt. He simply pivoted, his eyes tracking across the assembled court, across the ranked nobility and council members and lesser pack wolves whose bloodlines entitled them to watch the Alpha King's vows bind him to an alliance. His second-in-command, Moren, saw it first, the fracture that passed through the king's stillness like a fault line in stone. Moren's breath caught. Beside him, Elder Thorn, the council architect who had sealed this marriage for political gain, did not yet understand that everything he had built had just come undone. Era Shadowborn stood in the healer's corner, 3 paces from the dais, in a gray servant's dress that marked her station as beneath notice. She was 22 years old. She had spent 2 years in a provincial healing post, erased from the capital, her existence tucked away like something shameful. The day she had been sent away, no one had called it a banishment. They had called it an assignment. The healer's apprenticeship at the mountain post suited her temperament, they said. She was too quiet for court, too unpolished, too clearly unworthy to stand near her sister, Lissa Shadowborn, who was now supposed to become queen. Lissa had never looked at Era as a sister. She had looked at her as an erasure. When Era was born, 4 years after Lissa, their father, Lord Herrick, had brought home a child who carried something Lissa could not name. Something that made the adults in the room exchange careful looks and then look away. By the time Era was old enough to understand language, she had already learned to make herself smaller. Lissa had learned to make sure she stayed that way. The 2 years in the mountains had deepened the habit. Era had tended the sick in a hospice, built into a ridge that caught snow from October through March. The work was clean and necessary. The patients did not care about bloodlines or standing. They did not care that she moved through the rooms with her eyes down and her voice barely audible. They cared only that when she pressed her palms against an inflamed wound, the fever broke. When she mixed the herbs that grew on the southern slope, the pain eased. She had found a kind of truth in that work, something that required no performance, no hierarchy, no pretense. She was good at it. That was enough, until the summons had come, 3 weeks before the wedding. The letter had been brief. It said only that her presence was required at the capital for the pre-ceremony rituals. It did not say why a healer's apprentice from a provincial post needed to attend the future queen's wedding. It did not say that she would stand in a gray servant's dress while her sister was arrayed in white silk and gold. While the entire court looked on, while the machinery of the alliance ground forward toward its intended conclusion. The letter simply commanded her return, and so she had returned. She had arrived in the capital on a gray morning, the city walls rising before her like something she had once known and had worked to forget. The palace corridors were unfamiliar now, or perhaps she was different, small enough to move through them without claiming space. An attendant had given her the gray dress without meeting her eyes. Another had directed her to the healer's corner with a gesture, as if Ira might contaminate the ascending steps that led to the ceremony seats if she walked near them. She had watched as nobles filed past, their silks and jewels catching the light from the high windows, their conversations a careful music of power and alliance. None of them had looked at her. She had trained herself to expect this. What she had not trained herself for was the moment when every head in that hall would turn toward her at once. Now Cale's eyes found the gray dress in the healer's corner. He did not hesitate. He walked directly toward her, his steps echoing across the stone floor, the silence deepening with each one because no one in that hall had ever witnessed the Alpha King disobey his own designs. The wolves nearest him lowered their heads without instruction. The air itself seemed to compress, drawing inward like a breath held. He stopped in front of Era, and the world arranged itself around him the way it always did. She could feel the weight of him, not a physical weight, but something that pressed against the small space between them, a gravity that had no name. "What is your name?" His voice carried no warmth, no preamble. It carried the weight of absolute authority. A man who had never been refused, asking a question he already knew the answer to. Era's throat tightened. Her hand had begun to tremble at her side. She had trained herself during those 2 years in the mountains to be unremarkable, to swallow her voice, to move through spaces without claiming them. The healer's post had been harsh, but it had been clear. She was not to exist in any way that mattered. When she had been summoned back to the capital for the wedding ceremony, she had understood that summons is further erasure. She would serve. She would not be seen. Now the most powerful man in her world was looking at her as though the entire ceremony had been waiting for her to appear. As though the 400 witnesses, the ranked nobility, the altar and the white-dressed bride and the years of careful political negotiation had all been scaffolding built to frame this single moment. "Era," she said. The word came out smaller than she wanted it to, barely audible above the held stillness of the hall. "Era Shadowborn," the Alpha King said, and the way he moved her name through the air made it a declaration. He took a step toward her, and she felt every eye in the hall track his movement. "I release myself from the engagement to Lyssa Shadowborn. The alliance is void. I claim you instead." The silence that followed did not break. It shattered. Lyssa's scream came after, a sound of fury and betrayal that echoed off the stone walls like something alive. She had spent 2 years preparing for this, 2 years believing the alliance was solid, 2 years watching her father, Lord Herrick, position her as the future queen. 2 years being measured for wedding clothes and instructed on the protocols she would follow as consort. 2 years holding Era's erasure as part of that preparation, a constant reminder that there was a hierarchy, and that Era sat beneath it. Her father stood now with his hand half extended, as if he could reach across the hall and undo what had just happened. His face had gone the color of old stone. All the calculations, all the careful alliances, all the leverage he had imagined securing through this marriage were collapsing in the time it took the Alpha King to speak one other woman's name. He had gambled everything on this union, had traded his younger daughter's dignity for the prospect of power, and in a single moment it had been rendered worthless. Elder Thorne's face had gone pale. The man had orchestrated this marriage to consolidate his power on the council, to bind the Alpha King to a family line he could influence. He had pushed Era away, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The girl was a complication, a wild thing that did not fit the mathematics of his plan. He had not known that she was the complication the Alpha King had been waiting for. He had not known that her existence was not incidental, but essential. Morin stepped forward, and in that gesture, the entire inner circle acknowledged what had occurred. His hand moved to the hilt of his sword, not in threat, but in affirmation. This was the Alpha King's choice, and the inner circle would stand behind it. The court began to murmur. Some of it was shock. Some of it was confusion about whether they had just witnessed a public claiming or a public cruelty. Some of it was recognition, because there were older wolves in that hall. Wolves who remembered Era's mother, who had carried Stormborn blood through her veins, blood that had been carefully hidden, carefully erased, because a woman with the bloodline of kings posed a threat to alliances and councils and carefully negotiated power. The story that Era had lived through had never been the story she thought she was living. She had been born 22 years ago in the capital, the younger daughter of Lord Herrick's second marriage. Her mother had died when she was 4 years old, and with her mother's death, the family secret had been locked away. Era's mother carried Stormborn blood, not acknowledged, not claimed, but real. The Alpha King's own bloodline ran through her veins, through a line that wound backward through his cousin's line, a lineage that had been deliberately obscured to prevent exactly this scenario, a lower-born woman with a legitimate claim to the great houses, Lord Herrick had hidden this. He had hidden it because knowledge of it gave him leverage, and leverage was his only real currency. Elder Thorne had hidden this because it complicated the council's careful arrangement of marriages and alliances. Lissa had been carefully educated in this secret and instructed never to acknowledge her sister as anything but an omega too weak to claim standing, too insignificant to merit even family acknowledgement. But wolves knew. The hidden things sang in the blood, and the Alpha King, at 34 years old, had spent the last 2 years not betrothed to Lissa at all, but waiting for the younger sister to return to the capital. Waiting for her to walk into his view. Waiting for the moment when he could make his choice public and irrevocable. In the weeks before the wedding, there had been signals Era had not understood at the time. A healer's summons from the capital, requesting her expertise with bone work before the ceremonies. Moren had delivered the message personally, riding to the provincial post himself, though messengers would have sufficed. He had spent an hour with her in the hospice garden, asking questions about her methods, about how she read a patient's needs, about what drew her to the work of healing. She had answered his questions without really thinking about why the Alpha King's second-in-command cared about the opinions of a woman so far beneath his notice. There had been packages, seeds for the healing garden she maintained, books on herbcraft and bone setting, sent through merchants, wrapped in cloth that bore no mark. Once, a single white stone from the capital, smooth and worn, without explanation. She had kept the stone on the shelf above her cot, not understanding why it mattered to her. She had told herself that the packages were mistakes, that they were meant for someone else, that she had no reason to believe anything in the world was moving toward her. There had been Rowan, her wolf sibling, bound to her in childhood, long before the secrets had been sealed. He had appeared at the hospice in the winter of her first year in the mountains, slipping through the passes in wolf form when travel should have been impossible. The bond between them was old and deep, forged when they were both children, before the hierarchies had learned to rank them. He had never treated her as though she were the low-born thing her family pretended she was. Rowan had tracked her to the healing post twice a year, moving unseen through the mountains, his presence a wordless confirmation that he had not forgotten. He had never stayed long, but his visits marked the seasons. Spring, with the snow beginning to melt and the risk of rock slides. Autumn, with the first hint of early snow and the need to move healing supplies up from the lower passes. He had watched over her the way he always had, without speaking, without demands, simply present in a way that she had come to depend on. She had learned to expect his arrival by the way the air would shift, the way the wolves in the forest would go quiet. 2 weeks before the summons had come, Rowan had arrived agitated. She had never seen him like this, his silver coat bristling, his movements sharp and urgent. He had paced the small sanctuary where she kept her healing supplies, unable to settle, his distress communicating itself to her through the bond without words. She had tried to ask him what was wrong, but he had only pressed his large head against her hand, holding it there as if he could transfer knowledge through touch. The next morning, the summons had arrived. She had understood then that Rowan had known what was coming. "You were contained," Era said now, in the weeks after everything had shifted. They were in the library, sitting in the space where late afternoon light fell across stone. Cale had given her access to every room in the palace. There were no locked doors anymore, or rather, the locks had been made irrelevant by the simple fact of his claim. "By what you had already promised." "Yes." He sat beside her on the edge of the stone bench where she had been reading. The mark that would bind them rose along her throat, faint in the firelight, the beginning of the bond that would become irrevocable. It had appeared the moment he claimed her in the hall, a line of silver blue that traced her collarbone, visible only to him, visible only in certain lights. She had not yet learned not to be afraid of it, though she was learning. "I spent 2 years in a marriage I did not want to, a woman I did not choose," Because the council insisted it, he said. His voice was very quiet. I spent those 2 years knowing that somewhere in this city you existed. Knowing that you were mine before I ever saw you. Knowing that the bloodlines remembered even when the world had decided to forget. How? She asked. How could you have known? The blood remembers, he said. And your mother was my cousin, though none of us were permitted to acknowledge it. I inherited the memory of her. I inherited the knowledge that a daughter was missing from the inheritance. When you returned, I recognized the shape of what had been taken. It took one moment of seeing you to know what all of them had tried to hide. Elder Thorn moved against her in the council, but his move came too late. He had been humiliated before the entire assembly, his carefully constructed alliances exposed as fragile. He called her a liar, an interloper, a daughter of betrayal. He produced documents suggesting that Era's mother had seduced into the line, that the Stormborn blood was contaminated, that her claim was fraudulent. The documents were forgeries, written in careful script, sealed with a forged council mark. They were also, he believed, sufficiently credible to create doubt. But an ancient elder came before the council and testified. His name was Aldrich, and he moved slowly through the council chamber with the weight of someone who had outlived most of his contemporaries. He had known Era's mother. He had known that she carried the bloodline legitimately, through her father's line. The Stormborn kings, he said, had hidden her for their own political reasons, not out of any shame on her part. The girl was erased because she was too much of something, Aldrich said, his voice thin but steady. Too much bloodline, too much integrity, too unwilling to perform the self they demanded. A bastard-born Stormborn daughter with her own inheritance was inconvenient, not because she was unworthy, because she was too worthy and unknown to herself. Because a woman with legitimate claim to the throne could not be allowed to remain in play while the councils negotiated alliances among themselves. He turned to look directly at Era, sitting in the gallery. Your mother was my friend. She accepted the erasure to protect you. She knew what the councils would do to a woman with your bloodline if they could claim you first. She gave you her name and nothing else, hoping that would be enough to keep you alive. The Alpha King recognized what she had purchased with her silence. Era sat in the council chamber while this man spoke about her mother, about the bloodline, about why she had been sent away. Chaol sat beside her, not as a king beside a future queen, but as something harder to name. His hand had positioned itself close to hers. She could feel the warmth of him, could feel the way his attention organized itself around her even when he was not looking at her. Your mother was a healer too, Aldrich said. She trained at the hospices in the Northern Territories. She understood the work of tending wounds, of knowing which plants would ease suffering and which would cause more harm. She understood how to move through the world without being claimed by it. She passed that knowledge to you before she died, and you carried it forward in a place where they could not touch it. That is why you were sent to the mountains, not to erase you, to protect you. And that is what you did. You protected yourself. The court began to adjust. It is a property of hierarchies that they reorganize themselves around new power with remarkable speed. The wolves who had dismissed Era 6 months earlier now bowed when she moved through the halls. The attendants who had treated her as invisible now called her by her given name with careful deference. Lissa did not attend court functions for several weeks. When she finally reappeared, it was at her father's side, both of them visibly diminished, their positions at the upper ranks of the assembly quietly reassigned. They were moved to the secondary galleries, the kind of social exile that stopped short of official banishment, but made clear that their standing had been fundamentally altered. Elder Thorn stepped down from the council. Officially, he retired due to age and the strain of recent events. In truth, he had lost his authority the moment the Alpha King walked away from his carefully negotiated marriage. The other council members had abandoned him without hesitation, recognizing in his exposed forgery a liability they could not afford. A council elder who would falsify documents to maintain power was a council elder who could no longer be trusted with power. Era moved through these changes as though she were still the person who had arrived in the gray healer's dress, but she was not. Her body held a different knowledge now. She had been seen by the most powerful man in her world, and his seeing had been irrevocable and public. The hierarchy that had tried to erase her had failed. The deepest cost, she learned, was that Kale had given up the illusion of easy rule. An alpha king who was bound to a woman of his own bloodline, a woman he had chosen against every counsel his advisors offered, was bound to her in ways that could not be disguised as political strategy. The council had wanted him married to a woman they could influence. Instead, he had bound himself to a woman who had been raised outside their machinery, who did not owe them obedience, who could not be leveraged through family alliance because her family had already been stripped of power. The day of the formal claiming was conducted in the same throne hall where the unmade wedding had occurred. But the ceremony was different. Kyle stood not with another woman, but with Era, the gray dress replaced by a crown of silver and stone, forged from metal that had belonged to his mother's mother. The assembly bowed, and this time, the bowing was voluntary, because the hierarchy had reorganized itself around a truth it could no longer deny. Rowan stood at her shoulder, the wolf bond visible in the way he held his ground beside her, his presence a confirmation that what she had always been was finally, irrevocably acknowledged. His silver coat was arranged against her gray cloak, his head just below her shoulder, the image unmistakable. This woman was protected by the closest bond a wolf could hold outside of blood. The room seemed to hold its breath as they moved forward together. Lissa and her father stood at the back of the hall, no longer ranked high enough to stand near the dais. They stood in the shadows where they had sent Era to stand. Elder Thorn stood even further back, in the gallery reserved for observers, the shadows almost claiming him entirely. The men who had conspired to erase her watched as she was raised to the highest standing the world could offer. They watched as the court that had whispered her name as a joke now whispered it as a title. They watched as the hierarchy that had classified her as unworthy reorganized itself around her. When Kale took her hand, it was not a gesture of possession, though it appeared to be. It was a gesture of alliance. He had walked away from power organized around deception to bind himself to a woman who had survived deception without becoming deformed by it. The isolation that had been her constant companion, the sense that she did not belong in any space, that her existence was marginal and contingent, finally released. She could feel it lifting away like water draining from a basin, leaving behind not emptiness but a strange kind of rightness. The crown felt lighter than she expected it to. The mark on her throat burned warmly, and she understood finally what it meant. It was not a mark of ownership. It was a mark of being so fully seen that the seeing could never be undone. She had been erased because she was too much of something, too much bloodline, too much integrity, too unwilling to perform the self they had demanded. In the end, it was not the Alpha King who had changed the world. It was the world itself, finally forced to acknowledge what it had tried to erase. She was not claimed because she was broken and needed protection. She was claimed because she had survived being broken, and that survival had made her indispensable. In the years that followed, Era moved through the capital as the consort to the Alpha King, and the city reorganized itself around her the way cities always do around power that has been publicly claimed. But she did not change her essential nature. She kept a small healing room in the palace, where she tended to the wounded and the sick, just as she had done in the mountains. Rowan was never far from her side. Kale, for his part, became the kind of king who listened to the woman at his side when the council spoke and the hierarchies of the realm began, very slowly, to shift towards something more true. The gray dress was kept, folded in a cedar chest in a locked room. It was not brought out for ceremony. It needed no witness. It was enough that it existed, a small material proof that erasure was not permanent, that the person you were believed to be was not the person you actually were, that the lowest standing could be reversed by a single choice made public and irrevocable. One winter morning, Era stood at a high window overlooking the capital, and she could see the mountain peak where she had spent 2 years tending the sick and invisible. Kale came to stand beside her, and they were silent in the way that had become familiar between them, a silence that did not require explanation or apology. The city below moved through its routines, merchants opening their stalls, guards changing posts, the ordinary machinery of hierarchy and duty turning as it always had. But she was no longer outside of it. She was no longer invisible within it. "I would have waited longer," he said finally, "if it had taken longer for you to understand what you were." "I do not think I understand it yet," she said. "I think I am still learning." He took her hand, and the mark on her throat glowed faintly, the bond singing through her blood in a frequency only he could hear. It was not a mark of captivity. It was a mark of recognition, of being seen by someone with the power to make that seeing permanent. The world below the window continued its machinery. The councils made their decisions. The hierarchies adjusted. But in the room where they stood, in the stillness that had become theirs, what mattered was that she had not disappeared. She had simply been waiting for the moment when the world was ready to stop pretending she was not there.